A moment of tranquility shattered. Lillian Robinson stepped out of the local community center, a sense of contentment warming her heart. She had spent another fulfilling day organizing meals, facilitating workshops, and providing a shoulder to lean on for those in need. At 52, Lillian exuded a quiet strength that came from a lifetime of selfless service. Her modest neighborhood, nestled within the outskirts of a bustling city, felt like a comforting cocoon of familiarity. The late afternoon sun painted the street in golden hues, the air perfumed with the faint scent of blooming flowers from nearby gardens. Lillian adjusted the strap of her worn canvas bag, which contained pamphlets from the center, her journal, and a small container of leftover soup from the community kitchen. The weight of the bag pressed lightly against her shoulder, grounding her in the moment. It was one of those rare times when the world seemed calm and the daily struggles felt manageable. Lillian smiled to herself as she thought of her son, Logan, a civil rights attorney whose relentless pursuit of justice had become a beacon of hope for many. Despite the pride she felt for Logan, she often worried about the toll his high-profile career might take on him. Lillian had always preferred the quieter battles, the ones fought in community centers, church basements, and school gymnasiums. Yet, she knew Logan's work was crucial, even if it drew more attention than she was comfortable with. "He's changing lives," she murmured to herself as she rounded the corner onto her street. The neighborhood was alive with small but familiar scenes. Mrs. Johnson watering her roses, Mr. Peterson mowing his lawn, and children riding their bikes down the cracked sidewalks. Lillian exchanged warm greetings with her neighbors, her presence radiating the same gentleness she brought to every space she entered. But even here, in the heart of her community, subtle reminders of prejudice lurked. A young couple walking their dog crossed the street abruptly, casting wary glances in her direction. The woman clutched her purse a little tighter. Lillian sighed inwardly, but refused to let the moment sour her mood. Years of experiencing microaggressions had taught her to rise above them, though the sting never truly faded. As she continued walking, she spotted the familiar sight of her favorite cafe ahead. She decided to stop for a coffee, a small treat after a day of giving to others. The cafe was a second home to Lillian. The cozy interior, with its mismatched chairs and soft lighting, had always welcomed her like an old friend. She stepped inside, the scent of freshly brewed coffee and baked goods instantly lifting her spirits. "Miss Lillian," called Tom, a regular who always occupied the window seat. "How's the community center today?" "Thriving as always, Tom," Lillian replied warmly, making her way to the counter. Sarah, the young barista with a perpetually cheerful smile, greeted her with a mug already in hand. "The usual?" Sarah asked, her freckles dancing as she beamed. "You know me too well," Lillian said with a chuckle. As Sarah prepared her coffee, Lillian chatted about the center's upcoming art workshops. The excitement in Sarah's eyes reminded Lillian why she loved her work. Bringing joy and opportunity to others was her life's mission. As she took her coffee and turned to leave, the door burst open behind her with startling force. Lillian stumbled back as Officer Jack Miller stormed in, his movements sharp and abrupt. His face was flushed, his uniform slightly disheveled, and his expression carried the weight of irritation. Lillian barely managed to steady herself, clutching her coffee cup tightly. "Excuse me," she said softly, though the officer barely acknowledged her. Jack muttered a quick sorry, his tone curt and dismissive. His eyes were focused ahead, scanning the cafe as if searching for something or someone. Lillian hesitated for a moment. She felt a pang of concern for the man's visible agitation, but his demeanor made it clear he wasn't in the mood for kindness. Deciding not to dwell on it, she stepped out into the afternoon air, the coffee warming her hands against the growing chill. The streets were quieter now, as the sun dipped lower on the horizon. Lillian took a deep breath, preparing to savor her coffee. But before she could even take a sip, the cafe doors slammed open again. Jack Miller stormed out, moving so quickly that he collided with her a second time, this time with enough force to knock her off balance. The coffee cup tipped, its contents spilling in a hot, dark cascade over Jack's crisp blue uniform. Lillian gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. "Oh no, I'm so sorry," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "Let me help you clean up." Jack froze for a moment, staring at the growing stain on his uniform. Then, like a thunderstorm erupting in an instant, his fury exploded. "What the hell is wrong with you?" he bellowed, his voice cutting through the quiet street like a whip. "Can't you watch where you're going?" Lillian recoiled, her heart racing. It was an accident," she stammered. "I didn't mean to." "An accident." Jack's tone was dripping with sarcasm and anger. He gestured at his soaked uniform, his face reddening. "Do you have any idea how this makes me look? How am I supposed to do my job like this?" The growing tension drew the attention of passers-by. People paused, some clutching their phones, their faces a mix of curiosity and concern. Lillian could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their judgment pressing down like a physical force. "Officer, please," Lillian said softly, trying to de-escalate the situation. "I'm truly sorry. I can pay for the dry cleaning." "Dry cleaning?" Jack interrupted, his voice rising. "You people have no respect. None." The words hung in the air, venomous and loaded. Lillian flinched at the insinuation, her chest tightening. Before she could respond, Jack's hand shot out, faster than she could process. The slap landed with a sharp crack, echoing in the stillness of the street. Lillian stumbled back, her hand flying to her cheek. The pain was immediate, sharp, and searing, but it was the humiliation that stung the most. Her eyes welled with tears as she tried to steady herself, the world spinning slightly. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers. The street was silent except for the sound of Lillian's ragged breathing. Jack stood frozen, his face a mask of anger mixed with the faintest hint of realization at what he had just done. The crowd began murmuring, the weight of their disbelief palpable. Lillian, still clutching her cheek, felt a familiar presence aside her. A strong hand rested on her shoulder. She turned to see her son, Logan, his face a mask of controlled fury. "Mom," he said softly, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "Are you okay?" Lillian nodded weakly, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Logan." As the scene unfolded, the tide began to shift. Jack Miller, so full of rage and bravado moments ago, suddenly seemed to shrink under Logan's piercing gaze. The officer's eyes widened as recognition dawned. You're Logan Robinson," Jack stammered, his voice faltering. Logan straightened, his presence commanding. "That's right," he said, his voice low and steady. "And you just assaulted my mother." The balance of power shifted in an instant, and Jack's confidence crumbled. What had started as an act of unchecked aggression would soon unravel into a reckoning far greater than Jack could have imagined. The confrontation and the gathering storm. The street, once bustling with the hum of everyday life, now felt suffocated under the weight of collective silence. All eyes were on Logan Robinson as he stood protectively beside his mother, his imposing frame shielding her from further harm. The normally composed attorney was now a beacon of fury restrained by sheer willpower, his jaw clenched, and his dark eyes boring into Officer Jack Miller. Jack's uniform, still damp from the spilled coffee, clung to him like a badge of his shame. His pale face betrayed the panic brewing inside him. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, emboldened by Logan's presence. Phones were raised, their lenses capturing every second of the unfolding drama. Some in the crowd whispered Logan's name, recognizing him not just as Lillian's son, but as a formidable civil rights attorney known for holding people in power accountable. "You assaulted my mother," Logan repeated, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, "and you think you'll walk away from this?" Jack stammered, his bravado crumbling. I didn't mean to. It wasn't what it looked like," he sputtered, raising his hands, as though the motion could somehow erase what he'd done. His gaze darted around the crowd, hoping for an ally, but all he saw were disapproving stares and the glint of phone cameras. Lillian, still clutching her cheek, gently touched Logan's arm. "Logan," she murmured, her voice trembling, "please, let's just go. I don't want to make a scene." Logan turned to her, his hardened expression softening only slightly. "Mom," he said firmly, "this isn't just about you. It's about every person who's ever been mistreated by someone like him." His voice carried the conviction of someone who had seen too many injustices brushed aside. He straightened, his gaze returning to Jack. "You're going to face the consequences of your actions, starting now." Jack, who had been retreating step by step, tried to recover a shred of his authority. "Look," he said, attempting to sound composed, "this is all just a misunderstanding. I was having a bad day and—" "A bad day?" Logan interrupted, his voice rising for the first time. The power in his tone silenced even the murmuring crowd. "A bad day doesn't give you the right to put your hands on someone, let alone an innocent woman, my mother." Jack visibly flinched at the words. He opened his mouth to respond, but Logan wasn't finished. "You've abused your power," Logan continued, his voice steady but seething with controlled anger. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." The crowd, now swelling in size, began to mutter words of agreement. "That's right," someone shouted. "We saw what he did." Others nodded, their voices rising in solidarity. The atmosphere shifted from silent shock to a groundswell of indignation. Jack's eyes darted frantically. He raised his hands again, this time in a pleading gesture. "Please, Mr. Robinson," he said, his voice cracking. "I didn't mean, I wasn't thinking. I made a mistake." Logan took a step forward, his presence towering over the officer. "A mistake," he repeated, his tone dripping with disdain. "No, Officer Miller. A mistake is bumping into someone on the sidewalk. A mistake is spilling your coffee. What you did was deliberate. You let your anger, your prejudice, guide your actions, and now you're going to answer for it." Jack's shoulders sagged, his head dropping as if the weight of his actions had finally sunk in. But Logan wasn't done. "I want your badge number," Logan demanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who knew the law inside and out. "Now." For a moment, Jack hesitated, his pride warring with his fear. But the crowd, now firmly against him, left him no room for defiance. With trembling hands, he reached for his badge and recited the number. Logan entered it into his phone with precision, his movements sharp and deliberate. Lillian, standing quietly beside her son, felt a mixture of emotions, humiliation, anger, and an odd sense of pride. She had always known Logan to be brave, but seeing him stand up so fiercely for her stirred something deeper. Logan turned to the crowd, his voice carrying an unmistakable command. "If you witness what happened here, I urge you to come forward. Your testimony will matter. And if you recorded it," he gestured to the many phones pointed in their direction, "I'll need that footage. Justice only happens when we stand together." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several people stepped forward, nodding and offering their support. Some handed Logan their contact information, while others promised to email their videos. The collective energy of the group felt like a tide rising against the officer, who now stood helplessly amidst the sea of witnesses. Jack tried one last time to salvage his dignity. "Look, can't we just handle this quietly?" he pleaded, his voice barely audible over the crowd's noise. "I've got a family to feed. I've got kids." Logan's expression darkened. "You should have thought about that before you raised your hand against my mother. Actions have consequences, Officer Miller. You don't get to hide from them." The officer's face crumpled, his earlier arrogance completely gone. He looked like a man unraveling, every shred of his authority stripped away by his own actions. Logan turned to his mother, his protective demeanor softening. "Let's go home, Mom," he said gently. "We'll handle the rest later." Lillian nodded, her strength returning as she leaned on her son for support. Together, they began walking away, leaving Jack standing in the middle of the street, his world crumbling around him. The ripple effect. By the time Logan and Lillian reached their home, the story had already begun to spread. Videos of the confrontation flooded social media, garnering thousands of views within hours. The hashtags #JusticeForLillian and #HoldCopsAccountable began trending, amplifying the incident far beyond the quiet street where it had occurred. Lillian sat in her favorite armchair, her hands still trembling as she clutched a cup of tea Logan had made for her. The events of the day replayed in her mind, each moment more surreal than the last. "Logan," she said quietly, looking up at her son, who was pacing the room, "I don't know if I'm ready for all this attention." Logan stopped, his expression softening. "I know, Mom," he said, sitting beside her. "But this isn't just about us anymore. People need to see what happened. They need to understand that this kind of abuse of power can't go unchecked." Lillian sighed, her gaze dropping to her tea. "I just wanted a quiet life. I never wanted to be at the center of something like this." Logan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Sometimes the quiet life isn't enough," he said. "Sometimes we have to speak up, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who doesn't have a voice." Lillian nodded slowly, the weight of his words sinking in. She knew he was right, even if the thought of the spotlight terrified her. Taking a deep breath, she met Logan's gaze. "Okay," she said, "let's do this, but promise me one thing." "Anything," Logan said, leaning closer. "Promise me we'll do it with dignity," she said. "No yelling, no anger, just the truth." Logan smiled, his respect for his mother growing even deeper. "I promise, Mom." The days ahead. As the sun set on the first day of what would become a whirlwind of legal battles and media coverage, Lillian felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her quiet life had been appended, but perhaps it was for a reason. Perhaps this was her chance to make a difference, not just in her community, but on a much larger scale. Meanwhile, Jack Miller sat in his car outside the police station, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. His mind raced with the consequences of his actions, the viral videos, and the storm that awaited him inside the station. For the first time in years, the power he had wielded so carelessly felt like a distant memory. And this was just the beginning. The legal battlefield begins. The early morning sunlight filtered through Logan Robinson's home office, casting long shadows across stacks of legal documents and case files. Logan sat at his desk, his laptop humming softly as he reviewed video evidence, witness statements, and every piece of information he could gather. The room was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of his fingers on the keyboard. Outside, the world was waking up, but Logan's mind was already immersed in the fight for justice. Across town, the ripple effects of Jack Miller's actions were already taking shape. News outlets had picked up the viral video, and debates raged on social media. Some decried the abuse of power, demanding accountability, while others, though fewer, sought to excuse Jack's behavior as a momentary lapse. Logan didn't care for the noise. His focus was on building an airtight case that would not only hold Jack accountable, but also force systemic change within the police department. The weight of preparation. Lillian walked into Logan's office, a tray with 2 cups of coffee in her hands. She placed them on his desk, her eyes scanning the chaos of papers, sticky notes, and whiteboards filled with notes and timelines. "Have you set it all?" she asked, her voice a mix of concern and admiration. Logan looked up, his eyes bloodshot but determined. "Not much," he admitted, taking a sip of the coffee. "But I'm close to having everything I need to file the lawsuit." Lillian sat down across from him, her hands clasped tightly around her own mug. "I'm proud of you, Logan," she said softly, "but I worry about the toll this is taking on you." He reached across the desk, placing a reassuring hand over hers. "This is bigger than me, Mom. It's bigger than us. What Jack did to you, it's not just an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a much larger problem." Lillian nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I know," she said. "I've seen it my whole life. But seeing it happen to me, feeling it, that's different." Logan leaned back in his chair, his expression softening. "I know, Mom, And that's why I won't stop until we see this through. Not just for you, but for every person who's ever been treated the way you were. Lillian smiled, a mix of pride and sadness. Just promise me one thing, she said. What's that? Logan asked. Promise me you won't lose yourself in this fight, she said. You've always been so passionate, so driven, but don't let it consume you. Logan nodded. I promise, Mom, but I have to see this through. For you, for us, and for everyone watching. Jack Miller's world crumbles. Meanwhile, Jack Miller sat in a sterile conference room at the police station, his head in his hands. Across the table, Captain Harris leaned forward, his voice cold and unforgiving. You've put this department in a position we may not recover from, Harris said, his words cutting through the heavy silence. The video has gone viral. The mayor's office is calling for your immediate suspension, and the internal investigation isn't looking good for you. Jack looked up, his face pale and drawn. It was a mistake, he said weakly. I didn't mean to. A mistake, Harris interrupted, his tone sharp. You assaulted an unarmed civilian, Jack, and not just any civilian. Lillian Robinson is the mother of one of the most prominent civil rights attorneys in the state. Did you think there wouldn't be consequences? Jack's stomach churned. The realization of just how badly he had miscalculated was sinking in like a lead weight. I wasn't thinking, he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. That much is clear, Harris said, leaning back in his chair. But now you've not only jeopardized your own career, you've jeopardized the department's reputation, our funding, and public trust. Jack's hands clenched into fists. So that's it? You're just going to throw me under the bus? Harris' eyes narrowed. You threw yourself under the bus the moment you raised your hand to that woman. You'll have to answer for this, both in court and to the public. As Harris stood to leave, Jack's voice trembled. Captain, please, I have a family. I can't lose this job. Harris paused at the door, his back to Jack. You should have thought about your family before you let your anger control you. Actions have consequences, Miller. Welcome to yours. The case gains momentum. Logan's office was buzzing with activity. His legal team, a diverse group of passionate attorneys and paralegals, worked tirelessly to compile evidence, draft motions, and contact witnesses. The cafe's security footage had been authenticated, providing a clear visual timeline of Jack's actions. Combined with the crowdsourced videos from bystanders, the case against Jack was becoming ironclad. Logan stood before a large whiteboard, markers in hand, outlining the key points of their argument. We're not just suing Jack Miller as an individual, he said, addressing his team. We're holding the entire department accountable for fostering an environment where officers feel empowered to act without consequences. One of his team members, a sharp-witted paralegal named Priya, raised her hand. Do we have any evidence of systemic issues within the department? Patterns of misconduct, complaints against officers, things like that. Logan nodded. We're already digging into it. The department's internal records will be crucial. If we can establish a pattern of negligence or cover-ups, it strengthens our case exponentially. Another team member, David, chimed in. What about the witnesses? Do we have enough statements to corroborate the videos? We do, Logan confirmed, and I've personally spoken with several of them. Their testimonies are consistent and compelling. As the team continued to strategize, Logan's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen and saw an email notification from a prominent civil rights organization. They had heard about the case and wanted to offer their support. Logan smiled. The momentum was building. This wasn't just about his mother anymore. It was about holding an entire system accountable. The media firestorm. By the time Logan filed the lawsuit, the media frenzy had reached a fever pitch. Reporters camped outside his office, seeking statements. News anchors debated the implications of the case, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #JusticeForLillian and #EndPolicyViolence. Lillian, ever the reluctant participant, found herself thrust into the spotlight. At Logan's insistence, she agreed to do a televised interview with a respected journalist to share her story. Seated in a well-lit studio, Lillian felt a mixture of nerves and resolve. The journalist, a kind-faced woman named Vanessa, began the interview with a gentle question. "Mrs. Robinson, can you tell us what happened that day?" Lillian took a deep breath and recounted the events with quiet dignity. She spoke not just of the slap, but of the years of subtle and overt racism she had endured. Her voice trembled at times, but she never faltered. "I never wanted to be at the center of something like this," she said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "But my son taught me that sometimes we don't get to choose when we stand up. Sometimes the moment chooses us." Vanessa leaned forward, her expression earnest. "What do you hope will come from this lawsuit?" Lillian met her gaze. "I hope it brings accountability," she said. "Not just for me, but for every person who's ever felt powerless in the face of injustice." The interview aired that evening, and Lillian's words resonated across the nation. People from all walks of life reached out to express their support, their own stories of injustice, and their hope that this case could spark change. The first hearing. The courtroom was packed for the initial hearing, the tension palpable. Logan stood confidently before the judge, his arguments clear and concise. Across the aisle, Jack sat with his legal counsel, his face pale and his hands trembling. Logan presented the evidence methodically, the security footage, the bystander videos, and the witness testimonies. Each piece painted a damning picture of Jack's actions and the culture of impunity within the department. As the judge reviewed the evidence, Logan stole a glance at his mother, seated in the gallery. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, her presence a steadying force. When the judge finally spoke, her words echoed through the courtroom. "Given the overwhelming evidence presented, this case will proceed to trial." Logan felt a surge of relief and determination. The fight was far from over, but this was a crucial step forward. As he walked out of the courtroom, reporters clamored for his attention. He raised his hand, silencing them. "This case isn't just about one officer," he said firmly. "It's about systemic change, and we won't stop until justice is served." The trial of truth. The trial of Robinson v. Miller and the City Police Department began with a kind of media frenzy that only occurs when a single case represents something much larger than the individuals involved. This was no longer just about the slap. It was about power, accountability, and justice. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered daily, holding signs that read, "Justice for Lillian," and "End police abuse." News vans lined the streets, and commentators speculated about the broader ramifications of the case. Inside the courtroom, Logan Robinson stood resolute at the plaintiff's table, flanked by his sharp legal team. His opening statement was a blend of precision and emotion, crafted not just to sway the jury, but to inspire everyone listening. "This is not just about my mother," Logan began, his voice steady but resonating with passion. "This is about the countless individuals who have suffered at the hands of unchecked power. My mother, Lillian Robinson, is a symbol of strength, resilience, and dignity. She is here today, not because she seeks vengeance, but because she seeks justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who has been wronged." The courtroom fell silent as Logan continued, painting a vivid picture of the incident and the systemic failures that had allowed such behavior to persist. Across the aisle, Officer Jack Miller sat stiffly, his defense attorney whispering something into his ear. Jack's face was pale, his once commanding demeanor replaced by a look of defeat. The prosecution builds its case. Logan's first move was to call Lillian to the stand. She walked to the witness box with her head held high, her every step a testament to her quiet strength. As she settled into the chair, the judge instructed her to speak truthfully. She raised her hand and took the oath, her voice steady. Logan approached her with a softness reserved only for his mother. "Mrs. Robinson," he began, "can you describe what happened that day in your own words?" Lillian took a deep breath and began. "I had just left the community center, where I spend most of my days volunteering," she said. I stopped at the cafe for a coffee. It was supposed to be a normal day, but her voice trembled slightly and she paused to collect herself. But it wasn't. She detailed the events leading up to the slap, her words calm but impactful. The courtroom listened intently as she described Jack's escalating anger and the moment his hand struck her cheek. When she recounted the crowd's gasps and her son's arrival, there wasn't a single eye in the room that didn't reflect the weight of her words. Logan allowed her to finish before asking his next question. "Mrs. Robinson, how has this incident affected you?" Lillian hesitated, then said, "It's not the physical pain that lingers, it's the humiliation, the fear. I walk down the street now and wonder if people see me as a victim. I've spent my life building a quiet, peaceful existence, but that moment took something from me. It's something I can't get back." The defense attorney objected, claiming the line of questioning was emotional manipulation, but the judge overruled. "Her experience is central to this case," the judge said firmly. Logan turned back to his mother. "Thank you, Mom," he said softly, his voice tinged with emotion. "No further questions." The defense's cross-examination attempted to paint Lillian as overly sensitive and the slap as an accident, but her calm, unwavering demeanor dismantled their narrative. She refused to be rattled, her quiet dignity making their attempts seem petty and misguided. The security footage and witnesses. The next pivotal moment came when Logan introduced the cafe's security footage. The courtroom watched in silence as the grainy video played on a large screen. It clearly showed Jack colliding with Lillian, the coffee spilling over his uniform, and his subsequent outburst. The slap was unmistakable, a moment of uncontrolled anger captured for all to see. Logan paused the video and turned to the jury. "This is not a mistake. This is a choice." Officer Miller chose to lash out, to use violence against a woman who had done nothing wrong. And he did so while wearing the uniform of someone sworn to protect and serve. Witness after witness took the stand, each one corroborating the events seen in the video. Their testimonies painted a consistent picture of Jack's actions and demeanor that day. One particularly impactful witness, a retired school teacher named Margaret, recounted how she had been afraid to intervene but regretted it deeply. "I've lived in this neighborhood for 40 years, Margaret said, her voice trembling. "I've seen things like this before, but this time I had my phone. I recorded it because I wanted the world to see what happens when power is abused." Margaret's video, shown immediately after her testimony, offered another angle of the incident, solidifying the prosecution's case. Jack Miller's defense crumbles. When it was the defense's turn, Jack's attorney argued that the slap was a heat-of-the-moment reaction, not indicative of his character or professionalism. They presented Jack as a family man, a hard-working officer under immense stress. But under cross-examination by Logan, that narrative quickly unraveled. "Officer Miller," Logan began, his tone firm but professional, "you've been a police officer for how long?" 15 years, Jack replied. "And in those 15 years, how many times have you been disciplined for unprofessional behavior?" Jack shifted uncomfortably. "A few times," he admitted. Logan raised an eyebrow. "A few times. Would you care to elaborate?" Jack's attorney objected, but the judge allowed the question. Reluctantly, Jack admitted to a history of complaints, including excessive force and verbal abuse. Logan presented internal police department records showing that Jack had been reprimanded multiple times but had never faced significant consequences. "This isn't about one bad day, is it, Officer Miller?" Logan said, his voice rising slightly. "This is about a pattern of behavior. A pattern that your department ignored." Jack's silence spoke volumes. The jury shifted in their seats, their faces reflecting a growing unease. The department on trial. Logan's final move was to put the police department itself on trial. He called former officers and whistleblowers to testify about the toxic culture within the department. They spoke of a blue wall of silence that protected officers like Jack, allowing misconduct to go unchecked. One particularly damning testimony came from a former internal affairs officer who revealed that complaints against Jack had been quietly dismissed to avoid negative publicity. "The system isn't broken," the whistleblower said. "It's working exactly as it was designed, to protect officers at the expense of the public." Logan's closing argument was a masterclass in blending logic and emotion. He reminded the jury of Lillian's grace, the evidence against Jack, and the systemic issues at play. "This case is about accountability," he concluded. "It's about saying enough is enough. It's about ensuring that no one, not even those in positions of power, is above the law." The verdict approaches. As the trial drew to a close, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Lillian sat beside Logan, her hand resting on his for support. Jack Miller sat alone at the defense table, his once proud posture now slumped. The jury deliberated for hours, their decision carrying the weight of more than just this one case. Outside, crowds gathered, their chants for justice echoing through the courthouse halls. When the jury finally returned, their verdict would mark a pivotal moment, not just for Lillian and Logan, but for a community and a system desperate for change. The verdict and the ripple effect. The courtroom was packed to capacity. The energy in the room was electric, a mix of hope, apprehension, and determination. It wasn't just the people in attendance who were waiting for the jury's decision. Across the country, millions watched on live-streamed news channels, their eyes glued to the screens. This wasn't just about a single slap or even a single officer. For many, this verdict symbolized whether a system that had failed so many could finally be held accountable. Lillian Robinson sat beside her son Logan, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Though she had been composed throughout the trial, today her nerves were frayed. She glanced at Logan, who sat tall and stoic beside her. His presence was reassuring, but the weight of the moment was undeniable. At the defendant's table, Jack Miller sat alone, his face pale and drawn. His attorney, having done his best to spin a defense, now sat with his arms crossed, his eyes fixed on the jury box. Jack's career, his reputation, and his future hung in the balance. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room stood as the judge and jury entered. The air was so tense it felt as though everyone was holding their breath. Once the jury was seated, the foreperson stood, holding the envelope containing the verdict. The judge turned to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor," the foreperson replied, her voice steady. The judge nodded. "Please proceed." The courtroom was so silent that the faint rustle of paper as the foreperson unfolded the verdict echoed like thunder. She cleared her throat and began. "In the matter of Robinson v. Miller and the City Police Department, we the jury find the defendant, Officer Jack Miller, guilty of assault and misconduct in violation of his duty to serve and protect." A ripple of emotion swept through the room. Lillian let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Logan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, his expression one of quiet triumph. The judge raised her gavel to quiet the murmurs in the room, and the foreperson continued. "In the matter of the civil suit against the City Police Department, we find that the department was negligent in addressing systemic misconduct, fostering an environment where officers like Jack Miller felt emboldened to act with impunity." The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The verdict wasn't just a condemnation of Jack, it was a condemnation of the entire department. The judge struck her gavel sharply. "Order in the court," she commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. The sentencing. While the verdict was a significant victory, it wasn't the end. A separate sentencing hearing was scheduled to determine Jack's punishment. Logan, ever the strategist, used the time to continue gathering community support and preparing recommendations for systemic changes to the police department. At the sentencing hearing, the prosecution argued for harsh penalties. Officer Miller's actions were not just a singular lapse in judgment, Logan stated, his voice resolute. They were the product of a culture that prioritizes protecting its own over protecting the public. To send a message that this behavior will not be tolerated, the punishment must reflect the gravity of the offense. Jack's defense attorney pleaded for leniency, highlighting Jack's family obligations and his years of service. But when Jack himself was called to speak, his words rang hollow. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice trembling. "I've learned from it, and I just want the chance to move forward with my life." When the judge delivered her sentence, her tone was measured but firm. "Officer Miller, your actions have consequences, not just for you, but for the department and the community you swore to serve. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison for assault and misconduct." There was no celebration in the courtroom, no outburst of triumph, just a heavy sense of justice being served. Jack's head dropped as the weight of his sentence hit him. For Logan and Lillian, it wasn't about vengeance. It was about accountability. The department's reckoning. The civil suit against the city police department resulted in a historic settlement. The city was ordered to pay significant damages to Lillian Robinson, but more importantly, the court mandated sweeping reforms within the police department. These included mandatory bias training. Every officer would undergo rigorous training to address systemic racism and implicit bias. Independent oversight. A civilian oversight board was established to investigate complaints against officers, ensuring transparency and accountability. Body cameras. All officers were required to wear body cameras to document interactions with the public. Complaint reviews. An independent review of past complaints was ordered, ensuring that patterns of misconduct were not ignored. The changes were met with resistance from some within the department, but public pressure left no room for compromise. Logan's case had sparked a movement, and the people demanded nothing less than a complete overhaul. Lillian's new role. In the months following the trial, Lillian's life changed dramatically. Once a quiet community volunteer, she now found herself at the center of a growing movement for justice and reform. Though the attention was overwhelming at first, Lillian embraced her role, recognizing that her story had the power to inspire others. She began speaking at town halls, schools, and community events, sharing her experience and advocating for change. Her gentle but firm voice resonated with people from all walks of life. She became a symbol of resilience and grace in the face of adversity. "I never wanted to be in the spotlight," Lillian often said during her speeches. "But sometimes we don't get to choose our battles. Sometimes the battle chooses us." Her work extended beyond her local community. She partnered with national civil rights organizations, using her platform to push for broader systemic reforms. Her story was featured in documentaries, news segments, and even a best-selling book co-written with Logan. Logan's continued fight. For Logan, the trial was just the beginning. He took on more cases involving police misconduct, his name becoming synonymous with the fight for accountability. The victory in his mother's case gave him a new sense of purpose, and he poured himself into his work with a renewed vigor. But Logan never lost sight of his roots. Despite his growing fame, he remained deeply connected to his community, often visiting the community center where his mother had volunteered for years. Together, they worked on initiatives to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served, fostering dialogue and understanding. The ripple effect. The impact of the case reached far beyond the courtroom. Across the country, communities began demanding reforms, inspired by the Robinsons' fight for justice. Cities implemented new policies to hold police accountable, and grassroots movements gained momentum. Lillian's story became a rallying cry for those who had long felt powerless. Even within the police department, change began to take root. New leadership brought a focus on integrity and community engagement. Officers who had once turned a blind eye to misconduct began speaking out, knowing the public was watching. A quiet victory. One evening, months after the trial, Lillian and Logan sat together on the porch of her modest home. The air was warm, and the sounds of laughter and conversation drifted from the neighbors' yards. It was a rare moment of peace after so many months of turmoil. "Do you think we made a difference?" Lillian asked, her voice soft. Logan looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "I think we did, Mom," he said. "But the fight isn't over. It never is." Lillian smiled, her gaze drifting to the stars. "Maybe not," she said, "but at least we've shown that it's a fight worth having." And in that moment, beneath the quiet glow of the night sky, they allowed themselves a small but profound victory, not just for themselves, but for the countless lives their courage had touched. The battle for justice would continue, but for now they rested, knowing they had done their part to light the way forward.